break down the understanding of the voice in its mechanical components, like you have to understand. The voice is a machine. It's flesh and blood, sinew, it's all, yes, but it has physical properties that if you don't understand how they work, if you don't understand the parts, the anatomy, if you don't understand how the parts work together, the physiology, what right do you have to tell people how to use their voice? That's a tough question. It's a tough question. And all musical instruments function by means of three mechanisms. All musical instruments, including the voice. A power source, a vibrating mechanism, and an amplifier. Period. If you don't understand what those are and how those function in the human voice, you're stabbing in the dark like everybody else. The vibrating mechanism. What is the vibrating mechanism of the voice? The vocal folds, obviously. What's the power source? Expiratory force, air pressure. The voice is a wind instrument, like a trumpet or a trombone or a saxophone, right? The voice has to be amplified. If you ever heard what vocal folds sound like outside of your throat, they do not make a lot of noise. It's like, right? That's what their teeny pair of lips. What amplifies that? So we can make glorious sounds. The amplifier for the voice is an acoustic resonance chamber, like a megaphone, only very complex and malleable and articulatory. This is the crazy thing about singers. If we could put our throats and our mouths in the perfect shape to obtain maximum resonance at all times, that would be pretty great. But no, we have to articulate text while we're doing that.
Which is where a lot of the Burt Coffin comes in handy.
Ta-da! Well, what Burt Coffin realized, speech, words are the currency of speech and song. Vowels are. We don't sing consonants unless we're humming or singing bad R's or L's or something, right? We sustain vowels. Vowels are the currency of speech, and hence the currency of song. And if we could use those vowels to our advantage, we could solve all of these issues that occur when we have pitches and texts that are mismatched, that don't seem to go together. Anyway, well, I've skipped a lot. Where am I going with this thing?
We're kind of more in the approach of vocal training at this point.
So we'll go on with this. What Burt Coffin realized, and he realized it fairly late in his teaching career, both Mrs. Copham and Mrs. Dosher, who studied with Burt Coffin, the thing they loved about him, he was the first one to admit if something he was trying was not working, which allowed him to throw away these other pedagogies that he tried and failed. And it occurred to him, people talked a lot about vowel modification, they always have, but there was no real systemization to it. It was trial and error. And so he observed these great bel canto singers, and there are not a lot of them today, observed how they sang and what they did, and he began to realize, and then he began having conversations with his colleague across the street at the University of Colorado in Boulder, who was an acoustician. He began to talk to his colleague about the voice and began to realize the voice is an acoustically driven instrument. And began to realize what governed what's called the filter, or the voice's megaphone. There are two resonating cavities, the throat and the mouth, that can be because we can articulate, can be controlled by the singer. The mouth more so than the throat. And he began to realize that every different vowel that we sing has different acoustic principles or parameters, or in simpler terms, vowels have pitch. Every vowel has a different size and shape in your throat and your mouth. You can imagine that your throat and your mouth, as an acoustic resonator, is going to resonate at different frequencies relative to the vowel that you're producing.
He has a great set of diagrams within the book that show exactly those things.
So he and his colleague went across the street into his lab and began to measure the innate resonant frequencies of each of the vowel spaces. He identified which vowels match which pitches. Why is that valuable? Because we're not stabbing in the dark anymore. And we don't have to fight against the laws of acoustics. And people who deny that this is an issue are denying physics. So anyway, cracking that code, and yes, it's just a piece of the puzzle, but an essential piece, and a very important piece. He began to also make the connection between vowel choice, resonance tuning, and vocal register shifts. Most people recognize that. Chest voice, head voice. Head voice, whistle register. Yeah. Super whistle registers. There are many registers. Some try to deny it.
Some still do.
Some still do. But you can't deny physics. It works exactly the same way. I love to compare it to the trombone. A trombone, you can see the mechanism at work. 7 positions for the slide. In first position, the trombone can produce 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pitches, depending on which register. And so on and so forth for each slide position. And if the lips in the trombone are the equivalent of the vocal folds, that's exactly how the voice works. In any case, so before he died, not long before he died, he was able to take all of his research, his ideas, condense it into this beautiful tool, a very simple piece of paper that you put on your piano keyboard, which is the key to understanding the relationship between vowels, pitch, and vocal registers, and voice type for that matter. An ingenious tool, piece of paper, the chromatic vowel chart. Ever since I started using that in the 2001, I guess, I had students before that, and would be fairly successful, but there would be things about their voice that I'd lay awake in my bed at night going, wow, why isn't this working? How come I can't fix this? What's going on with the voice? I never had those issues ever again. Ever. I never had a voice that I was like, I don't know what to do with you. At worst, I'd have a voice that had physical limitations because of chronic illness, like asthma or some lung disease. And even then, it was helpful in deducing what the limitations were and how to develop workarounds.
Right.
But I like to say after that, after coming to comprehend the chromatic vowel chart and the very specific and accurate relationships between resonance, tuning, and singing, I was batting 1,000. Every student I had was able to sing significantly better, easier, more flexibly, more proficiently than before studying with me. So, yeah, that was a wonderful thing. Anyway, I want to backtrack to the University of Northern Colorado. One of the other great gifts of that institution, and remember that burning question I had about breathing?
Right.
I dragged
teacher couldn't answer.
Right, I dragged that with me from my undergraduate work through Michael Ballum, through my master's program. Still didn't get a good answer there, and was at the University of Northern Colorado. And as one of my pedagogy courses, I did what's called a viability study, because my idea for my dissertation was to actually perform physiological experiments trying finally to uncover what muscle groups or how the body produces expiratory force, how the body blows, in essence. And so the viability study was to make sure that hadn't already been done. And I searched exhaustively through all these medical journals and singing journals and crossover journals and speech pathology journals. The reason my teacher couldn't tell me the answer, the reason the respiratory therapists could not tell me the answer, is because the research had never been done.
So you were a pioneer in all of this.
So when you ask, what are the primary muscles of active exhalation? That's how you sing, by expelling breath. Nobody knew the answer.
Because no research had been done
Correct.
to find the answer.
I found 4 pilot studies that had been done. Pilot study meaning very small samples, like 4 subjects, which isn't a large enough sample to prove anything. And the exercises they were requiring of them were so broad that you really couldn't make any real deductions. And so I wrote this viability study saying the evidence is clear that more research really desperately needs to be done. And quite serendipitously, right next door to the music building was the kinesiology building on the campus at UNC at that time. And they had a state-of-the-art kinesiology lab. So when I presented this idea to my music advisors, they were not enthusiastic about it because it's well outside of the box for me to have. I'd have to get human samples, subjects, 40 of them, to be of any use. A huge project. They had no experience with that. They said, if you can get the School of Kinesiology to buy into it, we'll do it. But your dissertation is going to have to pass both schools.
Oh, goodness. That's a lot of people to say yes.
But in my exuberance and my youthfulness and in my burning desire to answer this stupid question, what does correct breathing mean? I did it. Used their lab, had 40 subjects, hooked them up to an electromyograph, which measures the neuromuscular, the electrochemical stimulus of the muscle. It's an indirect measure, but it's the best we have. Had them perform very specific tasks so I could measure the abdominal muscular response at very specific expiratory pressures, so there'd be no mistaking what was being measured and what the results were. And the results were so crystal clear, it was surprising to me. I was able to identify the primary muscles of active exhalation. And to my knowledge, I'm the only person who's ever done that, before or since.
So
anyway,
we have an answer then.
So I was thrilled at the study. I was like, man, I'm going to be rich. I'm going to be famous. And I told my music committee, and they all patted me on the head. Good job. And that the relevance went right over their heads. It has applications to not just singers, but instrumentalists. The medical profession, for crying out loud. My kinesiology advisors were much more excited about it. But even then, the application of it, they didn't care about, because they don't care about singers, right?
Right.
And they were so pleased with it, they used it shortly thereafter as an example of how to use statistical analysis to interpret data. EMG data being a relative measure can be tricky, but we were using brand new software that Dr. Gary Heiss had developed there so that we could turn these EMG signals, which is just a wave measuring the amount of electricity the muscle is, the stimulus is producing, then how do you plot that on a graph? There's no numerical value to it, right? So we had this software that would convert it, would calculate the average area of the wave and assign it a number. Integrated EMG is what it was called, the average integrated EMG, which allowed me to enter the data, 600 data points, into Excel and produce these perfectly accurate graphs and charts of the responses of these 40 subjects. First time it had been done in relation to this. Anyway, I had left Colorado and gone to South Dakota State University to take a position there when I finished my dissertation. And I finished it it was approved in the spring of 01. In the fall of 01? Oh, I'm so messed up.
Something around that time.
02. In the spring of 02, and I submitted it immediately to be considered for presentation at an international conference. The Journal of Voice, which is the gold standard for vocal research, has an annual convention where they present the latest and greatest research to singers, teachers, speech pathologists, and ENTs from all over the world, and laryngologists. So I submitted mine for consideration. I mean, this punk kid, I did one research project. Why not?
Yeah.
It was a home run. They selected me to present in Philadelphia in the summer of 2002. And so I went and presented my research, and it was a fascinating experience. You assume science is science, right? And there's no bias, right? Well, I soon learned that where human beings are concerned, there's significant bias. I was going to present, it's a very unique study that I did. So they put me on a panel. We presented in groups. There are 4 of us that would present every 15 minutes, then would convene an expert panel and answer questions about our research. There was a guy from Japan, Johan Sundberg, presented in my session. He was one of the guys I studied in my pedagogy classes, the great Swedish vocal researcher. And I forget who the other person was. And mine was the last presentation. And of all of them, mine was the most, the largest study. It was a sample size that was large enough you could draw conclusions. I mean,
the others were more like the pilot groups?
Right, pilot studies. And mine was far more conclusive. And I was fairly adept with the software, so I could, draw on the PowerPoint presentation and color it and do this this is, early 2000s. Had a great presentation. Before I was even presented, though, I was introduced to a woman who was doing similar research, only I had finished mine first. She was telling me about hers and her delimitations. In other words, you have to limit your studies. If it's too all-encompassing, you won't ever be able to finish or draw any conclusions. And I saw that as a weakness in hers. And she was not very nice. She kind of mad at me. And she was the protege. Gosh, I don't know. I'm going to get myself in trouble. The chair for the National Institute of Health Research and Voice was this person's teacher. So I had a vested interest in this person succeeding and me not. Come to find out, this person, this NIH chair, was moderating our session.
So bias from the moderator.
And I didn't know who she was. I didn't know any of these people. I was ignorant. Everybody else knew she was the one who controlled the purse strings for voice research in the United States. I didn't know anything. So anyway, I gave my presentation. It went very well. People got super excited because the people there understood what I had done. And there were 2 microphones, one in each aisle in this big ballroom, lined up, probably a dozen people, each microphone, began peppering me with questions about my research. The moderator stands up, and I'll not give her name. And she said, let's settle down for just a minute. Let's get all our experts up here and convene an expert panel. And you can start asking your questions again. So we did that. And they started asking me questions again, only me. They weren't asking any of the other guys.
They're bypassing even the person that you had studied in a pedagogy class.
Right. His was an interesting study, but it had some flaws. In any case, this began to bother the moderator. And at a certain point, she jumped in and she said, we have to assume that Dr. Peterson's results are flawed. And then she gave the old school. We talked about the integrated EMG. Before you could integrate the EMG and may turn it into a number to actually measure it, they would just do relative measures. You see this EMG wave, it's really big. This one's really little. And because it's a relative measure, your EMG responses are going to be different than mine because of our body chemistry and because of our subcutaneous fat and the different things and the moisture levels. So to compare me to you is of no value. It's a relative measure.